They told you the tank was invincible. They told you the Tiger was the king of the battlefield, a beast of steel and fire, 70 tons of armor, a gun that could punch through anything the Allies could throw at it, and a crew of 5 who were supposed to be more than men, machines of war in human form. But that was the myth, and this is what really happened. You step into the turret of a WWII in the summer of 1943. It's Michael Whitman's tank, and he's not just a commander, he's a legend, a man whose kill count is printed in newspapers, whose face is used to recruit, his name whispered like a prayer among conscripts, and barked like a challenge among Allied tankers. Whitman doesn't just fight battles, he wins them. He cuts through Soviet armor on the Eastern Front like it's made of tin. In Normandy, he disables an entire column of Allied vehicles in minutes, alone, his Tiger turning roads into graveyards. He is what the Nazis call a Panzer Ace, a knight in iron, a hero of the Reich. But look closer. What you won't see in the propaganda is how the war is already turning. How even the most elite tank commanders are being asked to do the impossible, fight without air cover, hold lines that don't exist, maneuver machines that break down more than they move. The myth was strong, but the fuel was running out. And then August 8th, 1944, Whitman is ambushed. A British Sherman Firefly, a tank built for the sole purpose of killing Tigers, fires. The Tiger explodes. There is no dramatic last stand, no heroic farewell, just smoke, metal, and silence. The icon dies, and with him, the illusion, because Whitman wasn't set alone. There were hundreds like him: Walter Knipp, Helmut Wendorf, Otto Carius, Johannes Belter, Kurt Knispel, Karl Wilhelm Kraut. Some lived long enough to question what they did. Others died before the war ended, buried in unmarked fields, stripped of medals, stripped of glory. And their stories, they aren't about triumph, they're about transformation. From pride to pressure, from heroes to hunted. You want to understand the life of a German tank commander in World War II? Forget the medals. Forget the propaganda posters. Understand this instead. You were trained to believe you were unbeatable and then sent to die in machines that couldn't keep up. The Tiger, the Panther, they were marvels of engineering, yes, but they were maintenance nightmares. Underpowered engines, overstressed suspensions, and complex transmissions meant that these beasts were only as deadly as the terrain and mechanics allowed. In the Russian mud, in the French bocage, in the ruins of Germany itself, that wasn't enough. Commanders like Walter Temm found themselves tasked with impossible missions, told to hold positions without support, told to counterattack with half-functioning tanks, told to inspire men who no longer believed they could win. Knipp didn't die in a blaze of glory. He died quietly, either by accident or suicide. No one's quite sure, because by then the Wehrmacht didn't just lose battles, it lost stories. The psychological weight was immense. You're no longer fighting for victory. You're fighting because retreat is execution, because surrender is shame, because death at the hands of the enemy seems cleaner than betrayal by your own side. You lead men who know they're walking into slaughter, and you do it because that's the job. That's the expectation. That's the legacy you were born into. Helmut Wendorf was one of the new generation, raised not just in the military tradition, but in the Nazi educational machine. Reichsschulen, where students were trained to kill before they could vote. They were taught that ideology and firepower were one and the same, that to lose was to betray the fatherland. Wendorf's path, from the Eastern Front to the hedgerows of Normandy, was one of adaptation under fire. He wasn't just fighting the enemy, He was fighting geography. The wide steppes of Russia had become tight, choking French lanes where Allied tanks could wait in ambush, unseen. Tigers were designed for frontal assaults. Normandy offered no such opportunities, and so commanders were forced into reactive warfare, trying to outthink an enemy that now had air superiority, numerical advantage, and time. Otto Carius knew the reality. A veteran of over 150 tank kills, he survived the Eastern Front, and later wrote about what it felt like to fight in a machine everyone feared, but no one could keep running for more than a few hours without repair. His memoirs aren't filled with glory. They're filled with doubt, with cold, with silence before the shell hits, with orders that didn't make sense, and commands that sent men to die for villages no one would remember. Carius, unlike many, survived. But survival was Hestet salvation. It meant living with the memories, with the faces of dead comrades, with the knowledge that you had become a cog in a regime that wasn't just defeated, it was criminal. Johannes Belter took a different route. He didn't write books, he didn't give interviews, he disappeared. You'll find his name on some unit rosters, a few commendations, then nothing. Some tankers talked, others stayed silent, and that silence, too, is part of the aftermath, because for every veteran who reflected, there was another who buried everything, who chose oblivion over confrontation. And what about Rudolf von Ribbentrop? The son of Joachim von Ribbentrop, Nazi Germany's foreign minister, and one of Hitler's inner circle. Imagine the weight of that name. Imagine trying to forge your own identity while carrying the sins of your father. Rudolf became a tank officer, fought on multiple fronts, earned respect for his combat skills. But no matter how many battles he fought, he couldn't escape the shadow of politics. He was a man trying to be a soldier in a world that no longer allowed that separation. After the war, he tried to tell his side, wrote a memoir not to excuse, but to explain, to carve out a space for individual valor in a war defined by collective guilt. But history is not kind to nuance. And then there were the ones who didn't live long enough to reflect. Kurt Nispel, the highest-scoring tank ace of the war, more kills than Whitman, less fame. Why? Because Nispel was no propaganda tool. He didn't fit the mold. He questioned orders. He grew a beard. He refused to execute prisoners. He was a soldier, not a Nazi. He died in April 1945, during the final collapse, buried in an unmarked grave, forgotten until decades later when his remains were identified. And Karl Wilhelm Kraut, same story, fought until the very end, died in chaos. No grand farewell, no final salute. Just another name on a list, another machine lost in a war that no longer had a front line, only retreat. You see, the tank aces began as icons, but they ended as ghosts. Because no amount of personal skill can compensate for a broken strategy. No amount of armor can protect you from betrayal, from starvation, from collapse. These men weren't just victims of enemy fire. They were victims of a regime that consumed its best and brightest in the name of an impossible war. The tiger was never invincible. The panther was never perfect. And the men inside, they were human. They bled. They cried. They froze in winter, burned in summer, watched their friends die beside them, trapped in metal coffins they couldn't escape when the shells hit. And when it was all over, when the last tiger burned, when the last shell was fired, what was left? Not medals, not parades, just silence. Unmarked graves, missing files, lives lived in obscurity, because the world moved on. And it didn't want to remember the soldiers who had once been symbols of an empire it had to forget. But you remember them now, not to honor, not to glorify, but to understand. Because history isn't about heroes or villains. It's about people. People caught in systems they didn't create, fighting wars they didn't start, dying for ideologies they only half believed in. So the next time you see a photo of a tank ace smiling in front of a burning wreck, remember what came next. Not glory, not victory, just wreckage, just ruin, just the brutal fate of World War II's tankers. There's a moment in every tank commander's life when the shell hits. Sometimes it's sudden. One moment you're scanning the tree line, the next, everything is heat and noise. Fire sprays across the interior. The loader is screaming. If he's not already dead, the driver's slumped over, and you can't breathe from the smoke. Sometimes it's slower. A track is blown. You're immobile. You hear the clank of approaching enemy armor. You radio for support. Nothing. No air cover. No artillery. Just silence and the knowledge that this tank is now a coffin waiting to be sealed. And in those moments, all the myths vanish. The training doesn't matter. The propaganda doesn't matter. The medals on your uniform, they won't stop a shell. What matters is what you did with your time inside that steel box. You remember the men, the ones who fought with you, the ones who didn't make it, the loader who cracked jokes even after his hand was burned to bone, the gunner who couldn't shoot straight his first month but died a sharpshooter, the driver who cried the night you told him they were sending you back to the Eastern Front. These weren't symbols. They were kids, farmers, apprentices, students who'd been promised adventure and delivered into hell. You think about the times you disobeyed, when you spared a Russian crew that had bailed out, when you lied to your CO about a supply run just to give your men 2 days of rest, when you looked the other way and let prisoners escape because you couldn't stomach what was coming. But those moments were rare because the system didn't reward mercy. It rewarded numbers, kills, captures, confirmed hits. You were a tank commander in a war where tanks had become currency, and you learned too late that every victory only bought you another impossible mission. By 1944, you weren't fighting for Germany anymore. You were fighting to delay collapse, to buy time, to protect the man next to you, or maybe just to survive long enough to see something beyond the war. And yet you kept fighting, because what else could you do? Surrender wasn't a guarantee. The Soviets weren't taking prisoners. The Western Allies were more humane, maybe, but you had to reach them first. That meant crossing a burning country, dodging partisans, surviving your own retreating SS units who considered surrender a betrayal worthy of a bullet. So you stayed in the tank, even when it broke down 3 times in one day, even when fuel had to be siphoned from wrecked half-tracks, even when the main gun jammed and all you had left was a machine gun and a prayer. And the people you fought, they weren't illusions. The Americans came with coordination and numbers. Their Shermans swarmed, always more, always faster. They had fuel, artillery, air support on call. They didn't need to be better, they just had to keep coming. The Soviets came with rage. Thousands of T-34 cells, battered but relentless. They learned from every loss, adapted, overwhelmed. Where your crews had weeks of training, theirs had days, but they came anyway, and they didn't stop. And eventually you saw the pattern. You'd win the first encounter, maybe the second, but the third, the fourth, that's when your tank didn't move, when your fuel was gone, when your crew was reduced to 3, then 2, when headquarters stopped answering, when the skies belonged to someone else. That's when you realized the myth of the Panzer Ace had died long before you would. You weren't instead a hero, you were a target. And for all your skill, all your kills, you were being hunted by forces that didn't care about your tactics, your medals, or your past. They cared only about breaking the last resistance of a regime that had run out of time. Kurt Nispa knew that better than anyone, he had the kills, the record, the experience, and yet he ended up buried in an unmarked grave. No fanfare, no glory, just another casualty in the meat grinder of history. He died like so many others, stripped of everything but his service. Because in the end the Reich collapsed like the tanks it once celebrated, massive, over-engineered, and unable to move under its own weight. And when the war was finally over, when Germany was a scarred wasteland of rubble and shame, what did it mean to have been a tank commander? It meant nothing. The medals were gone, the commanders were dead, or in hiding, the tanks rusted in the fields, or were dragged off as trophies. You were left with memories of screams in the headset, of the hammering vibration of the engine, of the smell burned rubber, cordite, blood, of the moment your gunner stopped talking mid-sentence because a sniper round took the side of his face, of the day you realized you were fighting not to win, but to delay being overrun. That's what the Panzer Aces really carried. Not pride, not legend, burden. Some, like Otto Carius, spoke about it, wrote about it, tried to give voice to the impossible position they were in. Professional soldiers in a criminal war fighting for survival, not ideology. Others disappeared, changed names, took jobs in factories, refused to speak of it ever again. And still others tried to relive the glory, clinging to the myth long after it had been exposed. They were the ones who showed up at veterans' clubs, trading stories that no longer held meaning outside their circle. But history does not preserve myth. It preserves consequence. And the consequence of Germany's armored warfare doctrine, of its obsession with elite machines, elite crews, elite killers, was ruin. The tanks were never enough. You couldn't blitzkrieg your way out of a three-front war. You couldn't engineer your way out of ideological collapse. And you couldn't train men to become legends without eventually turning them into corpses. The propaganda promised that a single tiger could hold off an army. The battlefield proved otherwise, because no tank, no matter how well built, no matter how bravely crewed, can hold off reality. That's what finally crushed the Wehrmacht. Not a single battle, not a single defeat, but reality itself. The reality that no war is won on glory alone, that no amount of tactical brilliance can compensate for strategic madness, that soldiers, however skilled, cannot redeem the sins of the state that sent them. So when the Tiger burned, it didn't just take a crew with it. It took an idea. That war can be clean. That heroes can be manufactured. That steel can substitute for truth. And that sets the brutal fate of the WWII tanker. Not death in battle, but death of belief, of purpose, of all the things you thought you were fighting for. And maybe that's the most important truth to carry forward. Not the stats, not the kills, not the names on the leaderboards, but the warning. That war is not about valor, it's about consequence. And that if you forget that, if you let the myth blind you, you'll find yourself back in the commander's seat, staring down a road that leads nowhere, engine dying, crew silent, waiting for the end. And the shell will come, as it always does, and it will not care who you were. So you're still sitting there, in the turret, in that seat built not for comfort but for control. The commander's hatch is open. Your eyes scan the horizon. What's left of it? Rubble, blackened trees, smoke columns reaching into a sky that no longer holds air cover, only silence. You were once the hunter, the one they feared, the one who picked off enemy armor like clockwork, cool and calculating, radio barking updates as your gunner made short work of another Sherman or T-34. But now the radio's dead. The turret traverses too slowly, the ammunition's down to a few high-explosive rounds, and one armor-piercing shell that's been stuck in the rack since Kiev. The roads behind you are gone, bombed out, choked with the carcasses of other machines, some German, some Russian. The retreat isn't even coordinated anymore. It's desperation, a slow unraveling of every chain of command, every doctrine you were ever taught. You are not advancing. You are surviving, at least for now. You think about the others, the ones whose faces you only ever saw through optics and scopes, Soviet crews scrambling across open fields, American tank commanders signaling from hatches. You shot first, that was the rule. Delay meant death. You were faster, more accurate, and in the early years better trained. But even then, they were learning. They were watching. They stopped meeting you head on. They started hiding, flanking, waiting. They built better tanks, not always superior, but faster, easier to fix, easier to replace. And they had more. That was the part no one wanted to admit. Quantity, when applied with competence, beats quality in a war of attrition. You're starting to understand that now. Your Tiger was king once, a monster in the right terrain, but that terrain is gone, replaced with tight lanes, hedgerows, and urban ruins, places where your long-barreled gun is too slow to aim, and your heavy armor can't pivot. You remember when you first climbed inside one, that awe, the sheer size, the way the steel doors sealed you off from the world. You felt untouchable. But then the first shell hit, and the second, and you learned steel is just steel. It melts, it shatters, it buries men alive. You remember the day you found a knocked-out Tiger. Not yours, another crew. Smoke still rising from the hatches. A shell had ripped through the rear. The fire must have been quick. You looked inside anyway. There were no bodies, just parts, pieces, melted flesh fused to metal, burn marks where fingers had clawed at the hatch. You were 19. You didn't just eat for 3 days, but you went back. Because that's what you do. The machine is hungry, and you're the fuel. There were brief moments, pauses between offensives, where you let yourself believe in something more. A future, a family, a life outside the tank. But each time the war pulled you back. Your leave was cut short, orders came through. Another front, another enemy, another retreat framed as a tactical repositioning. You stopped believing in the words. And somewhere along the line you stopped believing in victory. But you never stopped fighting. Because once you're in the tank, once the engine turns over, once the gun is loaded, there's only one direction. Forward. Always forward. Even if that road leads to nothing. Some tried to make sense of it afterward. Historians, journalists, survivors. They dissected battles, mapped out maneuvers, argued over kill counts. They turned your life into statistics. But you were there. You remember the screams over the intercom, the chaos when the turret jammed, the moment your loader bled out in your lap while you kept firing. You didn't sit count tanks. You counted the seconds between impacts, the days between food, the names you couldn't forget, and the faces you couldn't remember. There was no clean narrative, no sweeping arc of strategy or politics. There was only the grinding weight of reality. And for all the talk of heroism, there was so much shame. The civilians, the orders you didn't question, the prisoners you drove past without stopping, the way you looked away when someone begged for help because you were told they didn't count, because you were told this is war. And later, much later, you asked yourself what that even meant. What war justifies what you did? What uniform absolves what you allowed? You weren't SS. You weren't Gestapo. You told yourself you were just a soldier. But deep down you knew. You knew you were part of something that broke the world. You didn't have to give speeches. You didn't have to write laws. You only had to keep the engine running, the tracks moving, the barrel aligned. And that was enough. The system needed killers. But more than that, it needed workers, compliant men. Men who would do the job, turn the wrench, aim the gun. Men who believed, if not in the cause, then in the chain of command. You were one of those men. You wonder now how many others feel the same. How many sleep badly. How many never talk about it, not because they can't remember, but because they can't stop remembering. Otto Carius once wrote that tank warfare was the loneliest kind, that you could be surrounded by comrades and still feel completely alone. He was right. Inside the tank, it's just noise and pressure. The armor is both protection and prison. The outside world becomes irrelevant. You have a scope, a trigger. You see what you're supposed to shoot and you shoot it. You rarely see their eyes. That sets how you cope. That sets how you live with it. Because the moment you see the face of the enemy as a person, everything falls apart. But the war ended, and with it the world you knew. There was no parade for you, no handshake, no thanks. The uniform became a liability. The medals were buried in drawers or thrown away. You were interrogated, briefed. Then you became what you had once destroyed, just another civilian. You got a job. Maybe a family, a life. But the past didn't stay buried. It came back in the form of memories, dreams. The stench of diesel on a hot day, the crack of thunder that sounded too much like artillery. You never truly left the turret. You never truly shut the hatch behind you. For decades you watched the world forget what you couldn't. You watched films glorify war. Tourists walk through tank museums, tapping on armor like it was hollow, asking how many you killed, asking which battles you fought in. They never asked what it cost, what it really cost. Not to the enemy, not to the regime, to you. To the men you loved and lost, to the part of yourself you buried with every kill. That sips the brutal fate, not just dying in fire, but surviving it, living in a world that remembers the war but not the weight. You were never a myth. You were never invincible. You were a man, in a tank, on borrowed time. And now at the end of it all you ask the question every tanker asked at least once before the end. What was it for? You won't find the answer in the history books. You won't find it in the records, or in the propaganda reels, or in the medals locked away in storage. You shall find it in silence. In the knowledge that war does not reward the skilled, and that steel, no matter how thick, cannot shield you from memory. Not forever. The silence is where it lingers. Not in the clash of metal or the roar of engines, but in the quiet after the war ends, when the guns are cold, the smoke is cleared, and all that remains are echoes. The silence becomes its own battlefield, a place where the truth you avoided for years waits to ambush you. Because the brutal fate of the WWII tankers wasn't just fire and destruction. It was what came afterward. The emptiness. The disorientation of peace. No orders to follow. No turret to command. No enemy to outflank. Just a world that moved on without asking what you left behind. You remember how strange it felt, walking on a street without looking for cover, eating food you didn't steal or ration, sleeping through a night without explosions in the distance. For a while that felt like freedom. But freedom without meaning is just another kind of exile. You had been shaped by war, trained to lead, to kill, to survive. What use was that in the world that followed? Some of your comrades became mechanics, others construction workers. A few disappeared into the countryside and never spoke of the war again. You don't blame them. Because how do you explain to someone what it feels like to be sealed inside a tank with 4 men who trust you more than they trust the world? How do you tell them about the missions that never made it into the record books, the retreats disguised as defenses, the desperate radio calls that no one answered? You were part of something vast and terrible. You survived it. That should have been enough. But survival was never simple. You carried it all. The guilt, the pride, the confusion, the moments when you believed in the fight, and the moments when you didn't, when all you could believe in was the machine, the engine, the next shot. Even decades later, long after the war had become history for everyone else, you could still hear the clank of the treads, still feel the vibration of the main gun firing, still see the flash, the debris, the burning enemy vehicle, and still feel nothing. Because you had trained yourself not to feel, not in the moment, not when it mattered. And now that it sets over, it won't stop. You sit in a chair in your home watching the news and see modern tanks rolling through deserts, different flags, different wars, but the same steel, the same training, the same lie, that machines can make us powerful, that firepower equals control. But you know better. You know how easily a tank can become a coffin, how quickly an ambush can strip away decades of doctrine, how little the enemy cares about your rank, your record, your legacy. The shell doesn't care. You think of Kurt Nispel again, a man who broke every mold, refused to salute officers he didn't respect, called out war crimes when others stayed silent, the highest scoring tank ace of the war and buried like a nobody. It took decades for them to find his remains. They gave him a headstone, a proper burial. But what does that mean? It doesn't undo the war. It doesn't bring back the crew who died next to him. It doesn't rewrite the fact that in the end, skill couldn't save him. Not from chaos, not from collapse. And that's the truth they done. It's put in textbooks. That no matter how many tanks you destroy, no matter how many battles you win, there is no clean end. You think of all the tank commanders who never fired a final round, who ran out of fuel before they ran out of courage, who were forced to abandon their vehicles and walk back through enemy lines with no weapon, no uniform, no pride, just hunger and dust. You think of Karl Wilhelm Kraut, thrown into a hopeless defense, his Tiger surrounded, his orders meaningless, no reinforcements, no retreat, just the slow understanding that the war had already ended. He just hadn't been told yet. He died in the dirt. No fanfare, no last words. Just one more body in a war that ran out of meaning before it ran out of victims. And you think of the propaganda films, the ones that showed tanks rolling triumphantly through captured towns, crews smiling, waving to the camera, throwing chocolate to children. You remember being one of those men. The lens made it look like victory. But behind the camera, the engine was overheating, the fuel was low. Your loader hadn't slept in 3 days, and you didn't know if you'd make it to the next checkpoint. But you smiled anyway, because that was your job. Because war at its most dangerous isn't when you lose, it's when you're told you're still winning, even as the walls are caving in. You think of Walter Timp, the officer whose death was never truly explained. Suicide, maybe. Accident, maybe. Either way, a man crushed by the weight of orders that no longer matched the battlefield. A man who understood that no amount of tactical brilliance could turn the tide when the sea itself is boiling. You wonder if he saw it coming, if he knew the myth was dying, if he realized too late that history was not on his side. That's what it felt like at the end. Not defeat, but abandonment. The Third Reich didn't go out in glory. It dissolved in confusion, betrayal, and self-destruction. You weren't given a final mission. You were given silence, radio static, evacuation orders that came too late, ammunition trucks that never arrived, maps that no longer mattered. And as you sat in your tank, engine off, gun empty, watching the horizon burn, you understood the war didn't end. It unraveled. You didn't lose, you were discarded. Not because you failed, but because the system failed around you. They taught you how to fight, how to shoot, how to kill, but they never taught you how to lose. They never taught you what to do when the ideology collapses, when the commanders surrender, when the enemy is at the gates and the Reich you were told would last 1,000 years doesn't last a decade. So you improvised. You walked out of the wreckage, hands raised. You survived. And in the years that followed, as cities were rebuilt and flags were changed and maps redrawn, you were left to reconcile the pieces. Not with tribunals, not with therapists, but alone. You built a life, or tried to. But the past didn't stay in the tank. It came with you, in scars, in silence, in the sound of gears that reminded you of the turret traverse, in the smell of oil that brought back memories you didn't ask for. You remember sitting at a dinner table years later when your child asked, "Did you drive a tank in the war?" And you froze. Because the answer is yes, but the answer is also so much more than that. Yes, you drove a tank. But also, yes, you were part of something terrible. Yes, you followed orders you didn't question. Yes, you survived while better men didn't stud. Yes, you remember the face of the Soviet tanker you shot at 20 meters, who burned before he could open the hatch. Yes, you would trade the medals if it meant erasing just one scream. You didn't say any of that. You said yes, and left it at that. Because how do you explain to someone who's never seen war what it means to live with it? How do you explain that you missed the tank, not because it was powerful, but because it made the world simple? Inside the armor, there was no ambiguity, only orders, objectives, targets. Outside the armor, everything is complicated. And yet here you are, still alive, still carrying it. The brutal fate of the WWII tanker was not death in combat. It was life afterward. It was walking through a world that no longer needed you and no longer wanted to know what you had seen. It was silence and memory and the unshakable truth that when the hatch finally closes for the last time, there is no applause, only the long grinding echo of steel meeting steel. And yet, there's something that still haunts you more than any ambush, more than any retreat, more than any lost crewman scorched into the turret floor. It says that you got good at it. Not just competent, not just capable. Good. You knew how to read the terrain at a glance, how to spot the telltale shimmer of a distant muzzle flash before the enemy fired, how to feel the vibration of the tracks and know if something was wrong before it broke. You could coax a disabled Panther through mud so thick it swallowed Jeeps whole. You knew exactly how long it took to traverse the turret, how far to lead a moving T-34, how to calculate an angle of deflection with nothing but your gut and the twitch of your wrist. You became a master of something terrible. That's the thing no one talks about in the stories. Not the bravery, not the fear, but the craft of war, the discipline, the awful artistry. You were part of a machine of death, but you were also an artisan of survival. You had to be. Because the tank was not your weapon, it was your world. It was the last place you'd see if you made a mistake, the last place you'd hear a man scream, the last thing that would shield you before the fire came. And so you poured yourself into the work. into maintenance routines so obsessive they bordered on prayer, into gun drills so fast they impressed even the Waffen-SS brass, into formation discipline so tight your company could pivot across a ravine like a single articulated serpent of steel. And it worked. You lived longer than most, long enough to know that skill meant nothing when the system itself began to rot, long enough to feel betrayed by generals who ordered armored counterattacks without fuel, long enough to feel disgust when reinforcements were children, wearing Hitler Youth armbands and firing Panzerfausts with trembling hands, long enough to see the uniforms you respected handed out to cowards, opportunists, and butchers. You watched the professional army decay from the inside. First, the good officers were transferred or killed. Then came the party loyalists, the ones who saluted harder than they aimed, who measured courage by ideology, not action. Then came the rumors. ES executing Wehrmacht men for retreating under orders. Field hospitals refusing the wounded because their units were undisciplined. You stopped trusting the command structure. You started trusting only your crew, because in the end they were all you had. There was Hans, your gunner, born in Bremen, worked in a shipyard before the war, had a laugh like gravel and cursed like he was paid for every word. There was Klaus, the loader, 18, too young, too kind, wrote letters home with a pencil he kept tucked into his boot, used to sing under his breath while feeding shells into the breach. And Dieter, the driver, steady hands, eyes like steel, could drive blindfolded, and once did just to prove a point. They trusted you, looked to you when the smoke got thick, when the commander's Seps net fell silent, when the only order was hold. You didn't lead them because of your rank. You led them because in a war where the only constant was betrayal, you never lied to them. You told them when it was bad. You told them when it was worse. You never told them it would be okay. And when the shell finally came, because it always does, it came on a narrow road outside Prague lined with crumbling stone walls and leafless trees. You weren't even attacking, just moving to a new fallback line. A last ditch. You heard the shot before you saw the fire. It struck from the side, lower hull. The engine bay lit up like an oil lamp. Dieter never made a sound. Hans screamed once. Klaus tried to open the escape hatch, but the lock jammed. You kicked it open. You pulled Klaus out yourself. His hands were burned. His uniform fused to skin. He died 2 days later, delirious, calling out for his mother. You buried what was left of the others in a shallow grave and marked it with a piece of track you hammered into the earth. Then you walked. You didn't know where you were going, only that the war for you was over. You think about that sometimes. The sound of the tread breaking loose, the rush of fire through the crew compartment, the smell of scorched leather and antifreeze. That's the day you stopped being a tank commander. Not because the war ended, but because there was no one left to lead. You passed through villages with no names, saw German soldiers hanged by their own men for cowardice or confusion, saw civilians raped, homes burned, officers abandoned. You saw the Reich not falling, but eating itself alive. And when you finally made it to the American lines weeks later, ragged and half-starved, hands raised in surrender, they didn't shoot, they fed you, questioned you, moved you into a prisoner camp where they kept the guards polite and the gates unlocked, because where would you go? You stayed there for 6 months. 6 months to think. 6 months to realize the war wasn't just over, it had been lost long before you ever climbed into your first tank. The Reich had failed not because of lack of courage, but because of arrogance, because it believed that tanks could substitute for humanity, that machines could override conscience. that men could be bent into weapons without breaking. But you were broken, all of you. And when you were finally released, sent back to what was left of your home, you didn't know how to live outside of armor. You looked for work, anything, but no one wanted a former tank commander. No one wanted reminders. You changed your name. Stop talking about the war. Stop talking, period. People called you quiet, reserved. They didn't know your silence was a survival mechanism. A kind of shield, a new kind of armor. You found a woman. You didn't tell her everything, just enough. She loved you anyway. You raised a son. And when he asked why you limped, why you woke up screaming, you told him you fell off a motorcycle. He believed you. He never asked again. The world changed. It rebuilt itself around you. New governments, new cities, new wars. You watched tanks evolve. The Leopard, the Abrams, the T-80. Sleek, lethal, faster, stronger, smarter. But the principle was the same. Put a man in a machine, tell him to kill, call it duty. You watched modern wars unfold on television, pundits debating armor penetration ratios and reactive armor upgrades like it was a sports match. And you saw the same mistake, the same worship of steel, the same blindness to what it costs. Not just in lives, in souls. You kept your medals in a drawer, the ones that weren't lost in the retreat. You never displayed them, never polished them. They weren't set symbols of honor. They were relics of a world you barely escaped. Sometimes on long nights you take them out. You look at the Iron Cross, and you remember Klaus singing through burned lips, hands swearing as he cleaned the breach. Dieter smiling the last time you looked back at him through the commander's hatch. You remember their voices more clearly than your own, and you wonder why you lived and they didn't set. There is no answer. There never was. War doesn't care who steps better. It cares who steps left. And in the end, the brutal fate of the WWII tanker isn't just death. It's SUP's remembering. It's living long enough to understand that survival is not a victory. It's a burden, one you carry quietly, until the day comes when the last memory fades, the last shell is fired, and the war finally lets you go. You hope that day comes soon. But until then, you remember, not for glory, not for country, but because you must, because if you don't est, no one will. There sits a photograph in a box beneath your bed, faded, curling at the edges, smudged from time and the sweat of your hands. It's not dramatic. No medals, no tanks, no flags, just 5 men in field uniforms, arms slung over shoulders, smiling like they didn't know what was coming, dirt on their boots, cigarettes in their hands, shadows under their eyes. You were all boys in that picture, boys playing at war, still believing it had a purpose, that if you fought hard enough, well enough, long enough, something would make sense in the end. You kept that photo because it proves they were real, that Hans existed, that Klaus had a laugh that could shake a turret, that Dieter had a birthmark on his neck and a way of fixing the clutch when no one else could. You've stared at that photo so long you could redraw it blind. But you still can't look at it without that dull ache in your chest, the one that never quite healed, the one that reminds you of the moment when they stopped being soldiers and started being memories. Because that SIP's the final evolution of a tanker, from crewman to survivor to witness. It's not a rank, it's not earned. It's just what happens when you live longer than the war wants you to. And when you're the only one left, you tried to forget. After the war, after the camps, after the trials and rebuilding and all the noise that followed, you tried to lose yourself in the rhythm of civilian life. Hammer, shovel, steering wheel. But there's no rhythm strong enough to erase the cadence of your tank's engine, the sound of treads grinding over frozen roads, the mechanical symphony that becomes your heartbeat when you live inside a machine. You never spoke much about it, not out of guilt, though that lingered, but because words aren't built to hold what you saw. They aren't strong enough to carry the weight of fire, steel, and blood. They fracture, or worse, they dull it, make it manageable, neat. But it was never neat. It was chaos in slow motion. It was making choices that no man should ever be forced to make, choosing which path to take, knowing one leads to a minefield and the other to ambush, choosing which tank to cover with your last round, knowing the rest are out of range, choosing which crew members to save when the fire spreads faster than you can think. They don't write songs about that. There are no monuments for the moment you pulled a dying man from a burning tank, only to watch him choke to death on the mud beside you. No medals for the night you stood alone in a frozen turret, watching the stars, wondering if this would be your last shift, wondering if dying was easier than waking up another day to do it all again. But you did wake up, again and again, because that's what tankers do. You keep moving, even when the war is over, even when the tank is gone, even when no one's asking you to lead or fight or kill. You keep moving, through days that are too quiet, through jobs that feel too small, through a world that never once tried to understand what it asked of you. You built things, fixed things. You learned how to listen instead of command. You got older, and then one day, years after the guns went silent, you found yourself in a conversation with a man who never heard of Wittmann, who thought Panzer was a video game term, who asked you if Tiger tanks were as cool as they look. You didn't get angry. You just nodded. Because how do you explain that the tank was both your savior and your captor, that it kept you alive and nearly killed you more times than you can count, that the inside of that hull still lives inside your head, every sound echoing, every creak of the suspension, a ghost that never left? How do you explain that the worst thing about surviving is knowing exactly what you survived? The young men today have ideas of glory, of honor in combat. You don't fault them. Youth is always hungry for definition, but you want to tell them, if you could, that the glory fades fast, that what remains isn't the metal on your chest, but the burn scars on your hands, the ringing in your ears, the half-sleeping nightmares that never ask permission. You want to say there's no glory in tank warfare, only work, sweat, filth, fear, and the knowledge that for every man you outmaneuvered, every enemy tank you disabled, there was another coming, and another after that, and one of them, one day, would be faster. That is the secret of tank combat. No one wins. They just last longer. You've seen too many last stands to believe otherwise. You saw a crew in the Ardennes hold off an entire column for 2 hours. Their tank burned before the third. You saw a Panther reverse down a mountain road with no cover. The commander shot through the chest, still giving orders until his last breath. You saw too much, and you kept going. Now, all these years later, the war lives mostly in books, in documentaries, in curated museum displays. The tanks are clean, polished. Their engines no longer scream but hum under soft lighting and glass plaques. And the men who died in them, too many were never named, never buried, just vaporized, buried in forests, burned in vehicles left in retreat, erased. But not by you. You remember, you always will. You walk past a rusting hulk in a park, an old Tiger, maybe a replica. A boy climbs on it, laughing, pretending to shoot. His parents snap pictures. They don't know. They can't. To them it's just history. To you it's such a tomb. You run your hand along the side. You feel the bolts, the scars in the armor, the missing side skirt. You remember every weld, every repair, every time your crew cursed the gearbox and bled knuckles trying to fix it. You whisper a name, and then another. You say them not because you expect anyone to hear, but because if you don't say them, who will? Hans, Klaus, Dieter, Friedrich, Lenz, Rolf. Each name a weight, a memory. You close your eyes, just for a moment, and you're there again. Not in a nightmare, not in trauma, in a memory that taps all too real. The snow outside is thick. The engine's just fired up. The commander's hatch is half open, and the air is so cold it burns your lungs. But you're alive. The crew is ready, and the mission, whatever it is, hasn't gone to hell just yet. For a fleeting second, it feels like purpose. But then you open your eyes. The tank is cold, silent, a shell of what it once was. And you're not a commander anymore. You're just a man with stories no one asks for, scars no one sees, and a past that doesn't fit neatly into conversation. And yet, somehow, you stir still proud. Not of what you fought for, not of the uniform, but of the men you stood beside, of the things you endured, of the part of yourself that didn't break. You were forged in fire, not for glory, but for survival. And when you finally leave this world, when the last breath comes, you know it won't be in a tank. It'll be in a bed, in a room too quiet, surrounded by photos of a family that never saw you kill and loved you anyway. But even then, you still hear it, the engine turning over, the turret traversing, the call over the headset. Ready. You shall close your eyes. And once more, just once, you'll be back in the seat. Because that was your fate. Brutal, unforgiving, but yours. Until the very end.